Hi, I'm Randy Bent with Real Estate Professionals, and this particular pamphlet, if you want to call it that, would be one of the first pieces of paper you would see when you're buying or selling a property with us. And it really discusses what is agency in terms of us acting on your behalf with our brokerage. And the responsibilities of ourselves are sixfold, and we're obligated to protect and promote your interests. So we have to give you undivided loyalty. In other words, putting your interests above our own interests and the interests of the other parties. Everything you have to say to us or that we learn about the transaction itself or information about the property, we'll keep confidential. We certainly don't want to disclose it, which could be an advantage to the other party that we're working with. And the duty of confidentiality continues after this agency relationship ends. And beyond that, we are obligated to give you full disclosure in regards to anything that really deals with the relationship, the transaction itself, any conflicts of interest, and so on. Obviously, we need to be obedient as long as everything is lawful. And we need to use reasonable care and skill in performing all of our duties for you. And for accounting, we must account for all of the money and the property that's placed in our hands while acting for you. Now, for your own responsibilities as being a client under our fiduciary care, it'll include these things: compensating ourselves for expenses as a result of carrying out our responsibilities. There may be an agreed upon fee that's in a service agreement, and also disclosing to us anything that would affect the transaction. Especially if you're selling something, you will need to disclose any known latent defects, which are defects that are dangerous or a health hazard and cannot be detected by a visual inspection. Plus, you want to make sure you read all of the documents carefully within the listing or buying package, and if you're unsure of it, get some professional assistance. Now, there's different types of agency relationships. One of the primary ones is a sole agency, where the brokerage, including ourselves, represents either the seller or represents the buyer, as we see here in Figure 1. So besides being a buyer's representative or a seller's representative, there could be a transactional brokerage occurring. And that's when there's a potential conflict of interest, when one brokerage is representing both the buyer and the seller. Now, that transactional brokerage could occur with one realtor representing both the buyer and the seller, or the brokerage having two realtors, one representing the buyer and one representing the seller. Now, this only occurs when both parties are fully informed and voluntarily consent to this agreement underneath what's called a common law transaction brokerage agreement. That's a long term, but basically says that most things will be disclosed to both parties, and the only things that cannot be disclosed would be, of course, what the buyer is prepared to pay as the highest price or any terms that go along with that. On the seller's side, what the seller would be prepared to take as the lowest offer or any specific terms in regards to selling the property. The motivation of the buyer who's wishing to purchase the property, or the motivation of the seller wishing to sell, and any other personal information relating to either buyer or seller. Now we'll move on to customer status, where you've said, no, I don't want any agency relationship with the brokerage. Now, that might come from the realtor themselves, or it might come from yourself. And if that's the case, then there's no fiduciary duties owed to you. The duties are limited to honesty, reasonable care and skill, and not to give you any misleading information. Now, the brokerage might recommend that because there's a conflict of interest for, say, a long-term relationship that's been built with a relative developer and so on, and you, the buyer, in this case, as a buyer, would be put into a customer relationship. And the brokerage, when they recommend the customer status, whether it's buyer or seller, if you prefer an agency relationship, you should opt to go with another brokerage. So buying or selling a property is a big decision, and you'll want to make an informed choice. So what you'll want to do is understand the duties that both you and ourselves have and what that applies to the relationship. Now, also, there's a new legislation, well, it's not that new, it's been around for a few years in regards to what's called FinTrack, where we gather information in regards to meet the legislation, which is the Proceeds of Crime or Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. So in those cases, anytime that someone is buying or selling a property, we'll be gathering personal information and reporting that. And finally, on the last page is the acknowledgement by yourself that you're moving into an agency relationship or possibly a customer status relationship. The brokerage name is inputted, the names of ourselves acting on your behalf, and your signature are required, and then the date that this occurs. And it's not a service agreement. And in this, you can choose to have a sole agency where we're acting either as the representative of a buyer or a seller. You could go into a relationship where it could possibly lead into a transactional brokerage, in other words, where possibly we would both represent the buyer and the seller in the transaction. And finally, you may choose to just enter into a customer status relationship. We simply do not act as your agent whatsoever, and there's an additional form to complete. So hopefully that makes sense and covers the first of a few packages of information that you'll need.